I'm really excited about this panel, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to read the bio of our first presenter, Adam Thierer. He is I should introduce myself. I'm Aram Sinreich. I'm a fellow at the Internet Governance Lab and the director of the Communication Studies program here at SOC. Excuse me. Adam Thierer is a senior research fellow with the Technology Policy Program at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He specializes in technology, media, internet, and free speech policies with a particular focus on online safety and digital privacy. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Forbes, and he has appeared on national television and radio. Thierer is a frequent guest lecturer and has testified numerous times on Capitol Hill. His latest book is Permissionless Innovation, the continuing case for comprehensive technological freedom. He contributes to the Technology Liberation Front, a leading tech policy blog. Take it away, Adam.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this event. I want to begin by apologizing for being a little under the weather, and my voice might crackle a little bit. Don't worry, I'm not about to cry or anything like that. Yeah, I've been a little sick this week, so I apologize. So I've been asked to say a few words to begin in terms of high-level framing about overarching governance of the Internet of Things and how different sort of warring political philosophies or visions or paradigms might affect how we think about Internet of Things governance and technological governance more broadly going forward. And specifically to talk about how this sort of conflict visions between the so-called permissionless innovation vision and the precautionary principle tend to play out in tech policy debates and how we might see it or are already seeing it play out for the Internet of Things. So I want to begin by pointing out that even though I've written a book with the name Permissionless Innovation in the title, I take no credit for coining that term. In fact, it's hard to know exactly who to attribute it to. I've not been able to determine that through a lot of research. But the phrase is sometimes attributed to Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, a computer scientist who served in the U.S. Navy for many years. And she once famously argued that, quote, "It is easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission," in response to a question about how it is she made it in a giant bureaucracy like the U.S. Navy as a computer scientist for so many decades. She had to bend some rules and basically try to, again, ask for forgiveness rather than get permission to get things done. Now, Hopper's law, as it came to be known in engineering circles, is probably the most concise articulation of the general idea of permissionless innovation. But Hopper herself did not appear to have ever used the term permissionless innovation anywhere. And it's also not clear she was applying it to technological governance or public policy debates, but rather speaking about it in a more generic way about just a sort of way to get things done within a large institution, and namely the Navy. Now today, however, we often hear the term permissionless innovation thrown around more generally in discussions about emerging technology policy. But unfortunately, the scholars and advocates of the idea of permissionless of innovation who suggested it should be a governing lodestar for various technology policies don't always define what they mean by the term. None of them seem to be suggesting, however, that permissionless innovation is somehow synonymous with anarchy or no rules or anything like that. To the contrary, most of them, as I found, tend to not even advocate abolishing too many laws or regulations or agencies. Instead, it seems to be the case that most of the defenders of permissionless innovation are using the term as a sort of shorthand when they really mean to say something like, well, let's give innovation a little bit more breathing room in this space, or just don't rush to regulate this new technology. And that's generally consistent with my own articulation of the term, which goes as follows as I define it in my book. Quote, "Permissionless innovation refers to the notion that experimentation with new technologies and business models should generally be permitted by default, unless a compelling case can be made that a new invention will bring serious harm to society. The innovation should be allowed to continue unabated, and problems, if they develop at all, can be addressed later." Now, framing the term in that fashion makes it clear, as it pertains to technological governance, that permissionless innovation really comes down to setting our public policy defaults closer to green lights rather than red lights to begin every new technology policy discussion. It switches the burden of proof, if you will, to the opponents of technological change by asserting 5 things. First, that technological innovation is an important determinant, if not the most important determinant, of long-term human well-being. Second, that there is a real value to learning through continued trial and error experimentation and ongoing adaptation to technological change. Third, that constraints on new innovation should be the last resort, not a first, and that innovation should be generally innocent until proven guilty. Fourth, as regulatory interventions are considered, policy should be based on evidence of concrete potential harm and not fear of worst-case hypotheticals. And then fifth and finally, where policy interventions are deemed necessary, flexible bottom-up solutions of a more ex-post or responsive variety are generally preferred to rigid top-down controls of an ex-ante or anticipatory nature. Now, at least on the surface, that sort of governance vision for the IoT stands in stark contrast to what is sometimes called the precautionary principle as the basis or the basic default in tech policy debates or other debates. Defenders of the precautionary principle generally argue that new innovation should be curtailed or disallowed until such time as their developers can prove that they will not bring any harm to individuals, groups, entities, norms, existing laws, institutions, whatever else. Now, that being said, having framed things that way, I'd like to point out some shared shortcomings of both these visions, especially as applied to tech governance and IoT. First, as it pertains to attempts, as is the case with attempts to define permissionless innovation, defining the precautionary principle is difficult, and it's not always as rigid or black and white as some of the critics suggest. There are as many flavors of the precautionary principle as there are ice cream. And indeed, this has been why many people have criticized precautionary principle as a default in technology policy debates, because it often doesn't give us very clear guidance for exactly how and when to apply anticipatory prophylactic types of constraints, and then how to evaluate the trade-offs associated with precaution. This points to a second and deeper underlying problem faced by advocates of both precautionary measures and permissionless innovation, which is our collective ongoing inability to craft widely shared definitions of what we believe constitutes technological harm in various contexts. This is certainly not to suggest that no attempt has been made to do so. There is a voluminous literature on how to define technological harm. It's simply to say we don't seem to be any closer to finding concrete agreement about how and where to draw these lines, especially in the United States, in contrast to, say, Europe and other countries and continents. Of course, let's not kid ourselves. This is a challenging task when we get down to defining harms, because it's hard to find bright line answers to the questions when context is always shifting and meanings are constantly evolving. And that's particularly challenging as we debate what constitutes responsible innovation or socially desirable innovation for purposes of optimizing Internet of Things policy. So where does that leave us with regards to the future of IoT governance? I'm talking pretty abstract. Let's get a little bit more concrete. Well, first, I think we can all agree, regardless of our philosophical priors, that we must continue to try to refine and improve our risk analysis tools and to try to figure out how to make better determinations and also the NTIA in the United States, but plenty of other agencies have undertaken some sort of soft law process related to the IoT, including NHTSA, the FDA, the FAA, and many others. These soft law efforts they have undertaken have focused on a variety of things. I'll just check a few boxes on the kind of things that they've discussed. How and where to build in or bake in privacy by design, security by design, or safety by design. These reports and efforts have outlined best practices for data handling and ongoing data use and sharing. They have created guidelines for how to ensure better transparency and accountability of algorithmic practices. They have discussed how educational and awareness building efforts might be able to help at the margin deal with certain problems. They have also outlined the many laws and regulations that are already on the books that might affect the future of the Internet of Things, including not only very specific targeted statutes, but also the very sweeping powers that the Federal Trade Commission has using its unfair and deceptive practices authority to police ongoing efforts or practices in the IoT world. These reports have also outlined how state attorneys general and state consumer protection bodies have been active or could be more active in this space. These efforts have also explained how existing common law remedies can help potentially solve certain problems, including existing privacy torts or products liability law, product defects law, and so on. And finally, these reports have outlined how ongoing stakeholder collaboration will be essential to helping keep pace with these fast-moving technologies and finding ways to adapt as new circumstances and problems develop. Now, on that point, I want to briefly note that the Internet Society has an exciting new project underway called the Collaborative Governance Project. This aims to formalize these soft law processes and even help convene more of them and provide expert guidance or advice for how to successfully run them. It would even help train people for how to better run collaborative multi-stakeholder efforts to achieve better collaborative governance for emerging technology, including the IoT. That Internet Society effort's being led by Larry Strickling, who is the former head of the NTIA and who is a leading expert on these multi-stakeholder efforts and processes. Now, let's be clear about a few things in closing that are uncomfortable about the age of soft law and multi-stakeholderism for the Internet of Things and other technology sectors. I think it's safe to say that many of those who were involved in these processes throughout the Obama years and continuing on, who generally favored a more precautionary or anticipatory regulatory approach to governing the IoT, would have preferred to start with hard law solutions of some sort, and then maybe use multi-stakeholderism or soft law as a backstop, if at all. I'm equally certain that those who are in the room, who were innovators, who preferred more of a permissionless type of approach, were equally uncomfortable with the idea of coming to the table and having to deal with these processes and to try to make informal agreements when it wasn't entirely clear what the law or governance really even meant or how it would be enforceable. But at the end of the day, for the most part, all sides did come to the table. They did work together. They tried in a good faith way to make an effort to come to some sort of rough consensus for how to govern the Internet of Things and these other emerging technology sectors. They came up with informal guidelines. They came up with best practices. They came up with a variety of specific approaches and recommendations. And they even got a lot of sign-off from a lot of the players in these various affected industries and sectors. Now, plenty of questions remain about these processes, even if we were reluctantly coming to see that all roads lead to some sort of soft law, multi-stakeholder future for the Internet of Things. And the irony is that you'll find plenty of defenders of both permissionless innovation and precaution who will quite often be raising very similar concerns regarding transparency, accountability, and enforceability of these soft law processes or multi-stakeholder efforts. But I'm inclined to believe that no matter where you sit along that spectrum of permissionless innovation versus precautionary principle thinking, and no matter what your reservations might be to a world where we move into this sort of messy governance processes for emerging tech like IoT, that I'm more convinced than ever that this is the future, and the future is now. We are living through it right now, and much as Churchill said of democracy being the worst form of all government except all those that have been tried from time to time, I think we are well on our way to a world in which soft law and multi-stakeholderism is the worst form of technological governance, except all the others that have been tried before. In closing, I'll just say this. It's a pragmatic point and one that often gets people quite angry, but I'm going to say it, which is that even if you don't buy what I'm saying, and believe me, a lot of people don't, that soft law and multi-stakeholderism there's a certain method to the madness, I'm going to suggest that you don't have any choice. That the reality of the pacing problem and the so-called Collingridge dilemma is now gripping our world and not going to let go. The pacing problem being the idea that essentially technology evolves exponentially, policy evolves incrementally, and the gap between them is growing each and every year. And you have on top of that the problem of legislative processes that just simply cannot keep up. You have so-called demosclerosis setting in, where you basically have an inability to legislate on fast-paced, fast-moving sectors and issues. As soon as a bill is introduced, it's almost immediately outdated and something else surpasses it as a concern. So very little is getting done whether you like it or not. And that's not something that's easy for many of us to accept, whether you prefer more regulation or more deregulation. You're not going to get either. We have to understand that. And so we're seeing this breakdown or twilight of hard law for technological governance and the emergence of these soft law governance mechanisms to fill these gaps. The question is, do we want to get anything done? We probably won't get done what we all want to get done from our various perspectives, but some sort of soft law or multi-stakeholder approach probably will be the only answer given these new realities of our modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was illuminating. This is turning out to be one of my favorite kinds of panel, where we have two diametrically opposed voices, both of them passionate, principled, intelligent, well-read, and in the eyes of half the audience in the room, absolutely dead wrong. So I already have a million questions I would love to ask, but I think I'm going to wait until both sides have had their say. So let me introduce our second panelist. It's Dr. Gilad L. Rosner. He's a privacy and information policy researcher and founder of the IoT Privacy Forum. Dr. Rosner's broader work focuses on identity management, US and EU privacy and data protection regimes, and online trust. His research has been used by the UK House of Commons Science and Technology Committee report on responsible use of data, and he is a featured expert on the BBC and O'Reilly. Dr. Rosner's 20-year IT career has spanned ID management technologies, digital media, automation, and telecommunications. He's a member of the UK Cabinet Office Privacy, and they probably say privacy, and Consumer Advisory Group, which provides independent analysis and guidance on government digital initiatives, and also sits on the British Computer Society Identity Assurance Working Group, focused on online identity governance. He is a visiting scholar at the Information School at UC Berkeley, a visiting researcher at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute, and has consulted on trust issues for the UK government Verify Online ID initiative. He is also, wow, you've got a really interesting resume, a policy advisor to Wisconsin State Representative Melissa Sargent, and has contributed to legislation on law enforcement access to location data, access to digital assets upon death, and the collection of student biometrics. Take it away, Dr. Rosner.
It's true, they do say privacy, and I have to code switch depending on whom I'm speaking to. I need to call up my presentation.
Which is yours?
It says, that's, nope, was on the desktop. That's it, yeah. Okay.
Voila. Where's this thing? Slideshow.
Okay. Good, thanks. Thank you very much to the Governance Lab and to Laura and to Andrew for inviting me to be here today. I'm honored to be able to speak to all of you. This work that I'm talking about is part of a large IoT privacy research project funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and that report from that research will be published in May. So, if we overregulate, we lose future social benefits from innovation. I presume most of you have heard this. It seems intuitively reasonable, but it's not neutral, it's ideological. The ideologies underlying it are that the state is a leviathan that's too slow to keep up with the pace of technological change, that markets are better at regulating themselves than governments, and that we generally predict that the market will produce beneficial social outcomes. And this ideology forms a bedrock for permissionless innovation, which is a term and a body of thought and a political thrust that has been chiefly explicated by my esteemed colleague on the panel, Adam. And he's defined the idea of permissionless innovation variably, and we've heard some of these in his talk. As he told us directly, the notion that experimentation with new technologies and business models should be generally permitted by default, but also that it's the general freedom to experiment and learn through ongoing trial and error experimentation, and that it's about the creativity of the human mind to run wild in its inherent curiosity and inventiveness. In other words, permissionless innovation is about freedom. It's hard to argue with such precepts. Freedom is important. And so permissionless innovation implies the following regulatory strategies. Self-regulation, that the best solution to complex problems are almost always organic and bottom-up in nature, education and empowerment, social pressure, social norms, and voluntary self-regulation, versus command and control regulations and a bureaucratic scheme of mother may I. As Adam noted, also an important component of it is cost-benefit analysis, the need to identify trade-offs or opportunity costs associated with regulatory proposals and quantify them. The need to show evidence of a harm before regulating is a central tenet, that consumer protection standards have traditionally depended on a clear showing of actual harm. It's not enough to claim, well, it could happen, and that the burden of proof should be on those who favor preemptive and precautionary controls. And regulatory humility, and this is something that comes out of a statement by the now acting chairman of the FTC, Maureen Olhausen, who said it's vital that government officials approach new technologies with a dose of regulatory humility. Now, these are powerful ideas that find quite a bit of expression in Washington and other centers of governance. In his prickly and thoughtful dissent with the FTC's 2015 IoT report, Commissioner Joshua Wright wrote, where an agency's recommendations regarding best practices are not supported by cost-benefit analysis, firms may respond by adopting practices or engaging in expenditures that make consumers worse off. And industry positions on IoT governance are replete with the view that concrete harms must be shown prior to regulating. These are some industry comments filed for last year's Department of Commerce Green Paper on the IoT. The Chamber of Commerce writes, without evidence of heightened privacy concerns or consumer harm, there's no reason not to allow the IoT market to mature under the frameworks that exist. T-Mobile writes, NTIA and other federal agencies should only adopt regulations based on clear evidence of actual harm. And after balancing the need against the deterrent effects it'll have on innovation and investment. And the CTA writes, as a general matter, the increasing number of devices should not automatically trigger new regulations before acting. There should be evidence of real harms. Now, permissionless innovation's nemesis is the precautionary principle. And in Adam's words, it is the belief that new innovations should be curtailed or disallowed until their developers can prove that they won't cause any harm. That the precautionary principle holds that since every technology and advance could pose some theoretical danger of risk, public policies should prevent people from using innovations until developers can prove that they won't cause any harms. And that the future is by people who support the precautionary principle is something to be feared or planned, and this is known as stasis mentality. These are politically charged, narrow readings of the precautionary principle, portraying it as a force for prohibition. Adam and others draw upon the work of Cass Sunstein, who in turn drew some of his ideas from Richard Stewart, who wrote about the precautionary principle in environmental regulation, which is where you see much of the legal, policy, and academic discussion of it generally. Stewart categorized the precautionary principle in 4 ways. 1, that scientific uncertainty should not automatically preclude regulation of activities that pose a significant risk of harm. That regulatory control should incorporate a margin of safety. Number 3, that activities that present uncertain potential for significant harm should be subject to best available technology requirements to minimize the harm. And number 4, activities that present an uncertain potential for significant harm should be prohibited unless the proponent of the activity shows it presents no appreciable risk. The proponents of permissionless innovation are clearly aligning their view with this fourth category, imagining developers are to be required to prove a technology will do no harm before it's allowed to develop and flourish. But there's a problem with this. It doesn't really exist. Only a small number of technologies are regulated in this fashion, the most obvious being the development of new drugs in medical devices and in transportation. The reason for such prohibitory precaution in such cases is the potential threat to human life. But to imagine that such prohibition exists commonly in other domains of technology regulation, in particular consumer devices and internet technologies, is a straw man argument. In both the United States and Europe, there are very few examples of consumer technology regulation employing a prohibitory version of the precautionary principle. The very term permissionless creates an antagonist, the government and concerned parties, as foes of industry and the market, whose noble goal to produce social good and consumer welfare through innovation must be defended. The discourse of permissionless innovation fuels a general distrust in regulation by falsely pitting freedom against reasonable efforts to govern technology. In this, we can see that its roots lie in libertarianism's drive to remove as much of government from governance as possible. Generally speaking, the cyber libertarian's motto is to live and let live and hands off the internet. The aims to minimize the scope of state coercion in solving social and economic problems looks instead to voluntary solutions and consent-based arrangement. And that cyber libertarians believe true internet freedom is freedom from state action, not freedom for the state to reorder our affairs, to supposedly make certain people or groups better off, or to improve some amorphous public interest in all too convenient facade behind which unaccountable elites can impose their will upon the rest of us. And so while Vint Cerf's brief remarks that the early internet benefited from a permissionless innovation approach are being repeated, bear in mind that he is referring to a governance philosophy that is deregulatory in character, one that sees the state as the problem and not a potential solution. Naturally, this political philosophy fits hand in glove with economic actors' preferences for less regulation. Let's see. Oh, I think I jumped ahead. Okay. There's a missing slide, and this slide says that one of the filings with the IoT Green paper is from AT&T, and it says that regulatory policies that allow permissionless innovation encourage all players to pursue every conceivable market opportunity, promote investment and innovation, and consumers will benefit. I'd like you to keep that phrase, every conceivable market opportunity, in your mind. But let's turn back to the boogeyman, the precautionary principle. As I mentioned, the precautionary principle has been given the greatest voice in environmental regulations. One of the most known examples is the United Nations Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which says where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. This formulation aligns with Stewart's first and second versions of the precautionary principle. Regarding privacy and data protection, one Belgian law scholar sees the precautionary principle as valuable because it addresses issues of information and power asymmetry, spurs public debate, recognizes that monetary damages for future harms may be inadequate, and takes account of the uncertainty of scientific evaluation. On the first 2 points, he writes that since relations between citizen governments and citizen industry are obviously asymmetric, legislation protects citizens by counterbalancing the strength of governments and industry. One mechanism of doing that is precisely the aim of the precautionary principle in order to avoid risk-taking without a larger public discussion. As to the inadequacy of monetary damages, he writes that precaution considers that some damages cannot be repaired or compensated with money because not everything can be converted into money. This is particularly salient to privacy and data protection, where the potential dangers to individuals are so often non-economic: embarrassment, stigmatization, loss of dignity, intrusion, and decisional interference. This is also true for the longer-term, difficult-to-detect threats to autonomy, freedom of thought, loss of private spaces, and to a liberal democratic order. As with the environment, some injuries to the health of a democracy are potentially irreparable. Or, as another scholar speaking today has written, If we worry today about the entire population being dragged irreversibly to the brink of harm, we must regulate in advance because hoping to regulate after the fact is the same as not regulating at all. Let's switch gears for a moment and apply this thinking to one of the great issues of the day. Let's talk about Cambridge Analytica. What happened? Much is still to emerge, especially with 37 states' attorneys general getting involved now, but the basics, as we've been told, are that 50 million people had their data used in a way that either violated the letter of consent or the spirit of it, that the data was then used in a way that was either manipulative or politics as usual, depending on your point of view, that Facebook's internal governance mechanisms and technologies either failed or worked as intended. So what's bad about it? In the least, the events point to a violation of consumer expectations, which in the US is one of the big no-nos. In the worst case, Facebook violated its FTC consent decree and state laws. But the combination of Cambridge Analytica and the story of Facebook being used for Russian agitprop points towards a larger issue, the use of online platforms for electoral manipulation. As we're finding, this is both hard to detect and hard to definitively prove, but the central question is, what kind of response is befitting of this kind of potential harm? Let's ask ourselves, when Facebook was started, could we have foreseen Cambridge Analytica or Russian misuse? Could we have prevented them? Which governing philosophy should be operative to try to prevent it? Or should we just accept that it happened and now regulate or not after the fact? The questions are applicable to both the issue of attempted voter influence as well as the unwanted spread of information. Do these issues represent a failure in regulation? If not, if it was not foreseeable, and we are to now apply existing regulation after the fact, on whom does the burden fall to show that it will work? What is the subsequent feedback mechanism to show that it's working? If Cambridge Analytica was a failure in regulation, where did it break down, and does that imply the need for different regulations? With regard to governance, how does letting freedom flourish in the form of letting innovators pursue every market opportunity align with ensuring that people have the maximum degree of autonomy in the context of voting, as one example? The Niskanen Center, a libertarian issue advocacy organization, submitted this comment to Commerce's IoT Green Paper. The privacy concerns raised by the IoT are fundamentally no different from those raised by the emergence and proliferation of the internet. And if the internet didn't require a structured regulatory response, neither does the IoT. At this time, a federal approach to setting privacy norms would be premature and could have unintended consequences hampering innovation in the IoT space. But why should we just allow the market to set or interpret norms? The privacy issues of the IoT that are being identified by researchers include emotional and bodily privacy. The scale of sensors and their proximity to the human body will begin to stockpile emotional data about us and render our inner life more transparent. Children's privacy, that IoT devices in the home and connected toys will collect children's utterances, activities, and emotional states in ways we've never seen before. Manipulation, the scale and proximity of sensors renders us more transparent and thereby subject to greater degrees of manipulation. When does this become a consumer protection and decisional privacy issue? Diminishment of private spaces, making society more transparent, and surveillance capitalism, which is a very large topic, and I'll only briefly mention it here with this one quote from the scholar who coined the term, which is that if power was once identified with the ownership of the means of production, it is now identified with the ownership of the means of behavioral modification. The precautionary principle interrogates the existing state of regulation and asks, are we governing enough? Are we governing with all of the tools available? Are we doing our best at foreseeing and preventing harms? Are social values being championed at the same level as economic concerns? Permissionless innovation reflects a faith that new technologies inevitably lead to human mastery and control over our environment, as one philosopher put it, and imagines that collective action will always be superior to state power. Part of the difference between the political philosophies underlying the two principles is the answer to this question: do you see a problem? The precautionary principle is regulatory humility, accepting that when potential harms are odious, hard to detect, and harder to correct, it could happen is sometimes enough to slow or preclude certain innovations. All business models should not be allowed to survive. Some should be killed at birth. Innovation isn't universally good, nor is it under threat after 200 years of capitalism. If one believes that democratic institutions or privacy values won't protect themselves, that the boiling frog metaphor is one to keep in mind, then the precaution in our regulatory environment is essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilad. Oh boy, we have half an hour to talk about this at most. So let me delve right into it. Gilad, you brought up some of my questions at the end of your talk, but let me reframe them a little bit. So we have both industry and government kind of claiming that they're protecting citizens or consumers, depending on how you want to phrase it, from the other, right? The precautionary principle is the government saying it has to protect citizens from industry, and the permissionless innovation is industry protecting consumers from the rapacious overstep of the regulatory state. But what I didn't hear a lot of until the very end of Gilad's talk was the conversation about what the actual desired outcome is, right? I mean, innovation in and of itself is a means, not an end, right? None of us in this room, all of whom study technology and the governance of technology on some level, none of us would say that innovation is an inherent good, right? We use it to achieve certain desired social outcomes. So I guess my question is, let's begin with first principles. This is a debate about how innovation is best to be achieved in order to produce social outcomes that are for the good of the citizenry or the consumer base, however you want to define it. Can we at least agree on what those desired outcomes are, right? And who gets to decide what constitutes a harm? Who gets to decide, if you think about, the concept of permissionless innovation begs the question of who's asking permission or not and who's granting permission. And obviously we know that going into these kinds of situations, there are existing power relations, right? The fact that it's three middle-aged white guys on this panel debating the question of who has to ask permission to use technology in different ways and to enter markets in different ways is one of many pieces of evidence that point to the inherent problems here that are not being fully addressed in the rhetoric that surrounds this conversation.
I take issue with middle-aged.
Well, I mean, we're all very young at heart, but so let's see if we can get down to brass tacks and just begin by asking Adam and Gilad if you can at least agree on what the social aims that innovation is supposed to achieve are.
That's interesting. I actually don't conceive of innovation in that way. Innovation is economic activity, and as such it follows economic logic. It emerges from economic and commercial logic. And so its goal is to satisfy those logics. And in the US, that means following a maverick capitalism form of commercial logic that places great stock in the market being a force, or rather the rising tide that raises all ships. That's not a fact, that is an ideology. And the logics that sustain the institutions of capitalism and market activity in the United States they march to the beat of their own drum. And I would argue that in large part, to imagine social issues emerging from that is an overlay and is possibly, the wrong way to frame it. I think it's better to wonder, what is it that keeps the capitalist ship afloat? What is it that spurs market activity on? And ultimately, if you believe that it's economic in nature, then it's not really clear that there are social aims that are emerging from it in the way that we would discuss the idea of social values like democracy. The market doesn't care about democracy. Democracy is something that we impose orthogonally to market activity.
So innovation certainly, as you suggested, is a means to an end, and the end, I would argue, would be human flourishing. And human flourishing, of course, can be defined differently by different people, but in large part, innovation, which is really just trial and error experimentation with new and different ways of doing things, doesn't always have to be, as Gilad suggested, economic, purely economic, he said. in character. In fact, a great deal of interesting forms of trial and error experimentation have no commercial component whatsoever. I, in fact, have a section in my book and a paper that I've been working on for some time about commercial versus non-commercial distinctions in public policy, and how interesting it is that we have different regulatory regimes for functionally equivalent activities when one has money associated with it and one doesn't. Sort of a good paradigmatic example would be wedding photography has taken on drones as a new innovative way of getting nice pictures of the wedding party. In a great many contexts, this is something that your wedding photographer will bring as part of the package that he will charge you for, so that's economic innovation. But in large part, this is just being done spontaneously and bottom up by average wedding goers saying, hey, I've got a drone in my trunk with a camera on it. Would you like a shot of the wedding party? What's interesting about that is these activities are regulated somewhat differently based upon whether or not a penny or a dollar was charged or whatever for the taking of the photo. And I have many, many other examples like that involving 3D printing, coding, a variety of other things. A great deal of hacking activity is non-economic in character, so on and so forth. So I think it's a very narrow reading of innovation to say it's just purely economic or part of a capitalist superstructure or whatever else. But certainly markets are an important part of how innovation manifests itself because at some point people do need to figure out how to keep those said innovations afloat, how to make something work, how to create a business model. And what Gilad suggested in the closing of his remarks is that, as he said, quote, not all business models should be allowed to survive. Some should be killed at birth. And I think there is a case to be made that some business models and some technology should be killed at birth. But I think we need to have a high standard for what euthanizing innovation looks like. I think we need to have some sort of criteria that basically suggest that there is a clear and an ambiguous harm of an immediate, irreversible, catastrophic nature associated with said innovations before we just willy-nilly say, no, not allowed. And there is a great deal of public policy even in the United States, of that variety, contrary to what Gilad suggests. Each and every type of licensing regime or permitting regime or any sort of restrictive covenant that is put in place by an agency with an F in the title, such as the FCC or any others, FAA, is a form of precautionary regulation. It says thou shall not until you achieve some sort of standard of proof that the innovation should be allowed. So these policies do, these philosophies and these policies do affect public policy, and I think, generally speaking, I still stand with those who would say that, generally speaking, business models should be allowed to survive until such time somebody can prove that they should not.
Yes, so we've got some questions from the floor, I believe, and we also have some questions from the live stream, which Andrew will be fielding. Do we have anyone in the room who wants to ask?
Okay, so while we're waiting for the live stream, Professor DeNardis.
Thanks very much to both of you for the great presentations and Aaron for moderating. The question I have is about how we contextualize this into the real world. So what I study is global internet governance, and the last thing that I would want in certain areas of technology is the application of, for example, the precautionary principle in Russia over certain technologies, or the application of the precautionary principle in China. They apply it very well with censorship, and in Russia, gay people can go to jail for what they say online. In other places, it makes sense, and the same thing with permissionless innovation. So could I ask the speakers if they could give us one real-world example of that plays out, their philosophy to help us contextualize it. And if it's not one that's already happened, even maybe a speculation about what could happen in the IoT. So real or imagined, contextualize it in a real world example for us.
So I begin, I think, chapter 2 of my book by discussing sort of natural real-world experiments that we've seen with Internet Governance 1.0, if you will, and how there was a very interesting transatlantic conflict divisions, if you will, about Internet governance that developed in the mid-90s when the Clinton administration came out with one vision for the way of running the Internet, namely the approach that they articulated in the framework for global electronic commerce, which was very much multi-stakeholder oriented, civil society deliberations, market-based mechanisms, so on and so forth. Sort of a true bottom-up permissionless innovation vision was articulated by the Clinton administration. In contrast to that, there was a different approach taken in Europe, and it was somewhat more heavy-handed, specifically around the data directive and other subsequent regulations. And I believe there's something that can be shown from this, regardless of whatever one thinks about the approach that Europe has taken with regards to data directives and privacy regulations. It has had consequences. It is very, very hard to name many information technology innovators emanating out of Europe that are based there. Most of them, and the VC money, the venture capitalist money, flock to US shores because of a different governance arrangement. And so that's a pretty good example of what I call global innovation arbitrage at work, that innovation like capital will move around to where it's treated most hospitably. And again, that can have negative consequences. I would not deny that. I'm certainly not a fan of the kind of things, Laura, that you suggested that are happening in Russia and other countries where we see a federated internet or a splinternet approach, especially when it leads to less freedom of speech, a denial of human rights, and so on and so forth. That's the dark side of that sort of an approach. But we would be foolish to deny that this happens and that it doesn't have consequences. I just think that the United States came out on the better end of it, because we do have the world's household names now in terms of information technology platforms, companies, and innovators, and people still do flock here to develop these tools and technologies, and I think they've had a lot of benefits from that policy approach.
I just briefly want to answer your first question. The part that Adam answered at the end of his answer, I'll answer first, which is you were wondering about the application of these principles in more authoritarian regimes. And so the precaution and precautionary principle is protecting something. And the question is what? And so in the version that I like, in what I wish to protect personally, these are democratic ideas, forms, and freedoms and liberties, and protection of the populace. And so the caution is about the loss of those things. And so this inherently becomes about values. And so the application of it in more authoritarian regimes, I would argue the idea that it is not about a cautionary approach, unless you want to apply it in the sense of a cautionary approach to the destabilization of a one-party system in a particular country. So, but to sort of cite an example, the one I've been thinking about of late is electioneering law, which says that you can't campaign within X feet of a polling station. Now, this emerged from a variety of historical reasons, but you can look at it from the perspective that preventing campaigning near polling places is trying to take a measure of caution against the integrity of voting, because we acknowledge the idea that people can be swayed and that their ability to make decisions can be affected through a variety of mechanisms. And that by having active campaigning at the moment of voting could possibly injure the integrity of the voting system. So that's one example that I think is an application of it. Another application of it is the area that you discussed in your talk, which is the idea of cybersecurity. At this point, though, if you start from the perspective of saying we need to show a harm before we should regulate, the Dyn attack is a pretty big, obvious harm. Then we're no longer precautionary. Now it's just reactionary regulation, which in the case of cybersecurity, I don't care. It's fine. Let's get some regs on the books. Let's create duties in the law so that they have to do it. But in general, and the other issue that I think about is manipulation. And if you want to read about that, Ryan Kahlo's work on that is excellent. But in general, I worry about people being unduly manipulated. You're hearing of late with Facebook, Sean, what's his name, who started Napster, who's one of the major...
Parker.
I'm sorry?
Parker.
Sean Parker, exactly saying, oh my God, look what we did. We made this thing where we're basically, trying to cause people to keep pressing the button over and over. How many likes did I get? How many likes did I get? He's acknowledging this as a way that they're trying to essentially, that they designed a system that way. Now, those systems exist all over the place. The commercial market wants you to do certain things. The logic of the commercial market and the logic of social media wants you to share, wants you to buy, wants you to disclose. But we get to a point where it becomes manipulation in a way that we find odious from the perspective of consumer protection. And so the caution that I want to implement would be preventing odious forms of manipulation, odious forms of discrimination.
Have we got another question in the room? Dia?
Good morning. My name is Dia Basu. I'm a PhD student here at the School of Communication and a doctoral fellow at the Internet Governance Lab. My question is to Adam, and I agree with you that the US has been a terrific place for innovation and new ideas, especially with technology, digital technology in particular. My question, though, is that while these innovations and these models of governance have been promoted here in terms of the soft law approach, your bigger markets today are countries like China and India, which have far bigger digital populations. And we have seen that US companies do capitulate to demands of those governments that don't follow, despite their public posture, of a multi-stakeholder approach. So, and I'm thinking of Apple in China and the numerous takedown notices that Indian government puts on American technology companies. So the flip side of capital going where it's most hospitable is also capital is pretty much a coward. So, you know, how do you see this balancing of where you see capital being driven by market forces, which may not be such a good thing?
Well, that's a legitimate problem you've identified there. It's one that I've written about for many, many years. I wrote a book in 2002, edited a book in 2002 called Who Rules the Net that talked extensively about these sorts of problems and the questions of when companies would choose to make a decision to pull out of markets like that, or would they stay because of the value associated with staying. And there is a real problem associated with them staying if they're giving up on essential rights, and I would never, ever condone that kind of activity. The question is, are we better off when large companies, multinational companies, engage in those sorts of repressive states or markets and see if they can get any sort of traction or any sort of freedom advanced at all? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. And I've written about how torn I am about some companies staying in these markets and how I'd like to see them pull out. I'd like to see our government lend them some more support, not economic support, but just use the bully pulpit to say, like, we think these companies deserve a fair shake and we don't want them to be manipulated or forced to cave to these ridiculous demands, whether they're on human rights grounds or speech grounds or whatever else. But you know, part of a multi-stakeholder process, namely the overarching internet multi-stakeholder process that continues, is supposed to try to help solve some of these problems. Now, oftentimes it does not, because some of these states are so repressive that it's impossible to imagine that Putin in Russia or anyone in China is going to cave to whatever ICANN or various international governance bodies say is in the public good.
Do we have a question from the web? Not yet. So I'm going to use my prerogative while the mic is being passed around to ask one more question, which is there's been an idea in some fashion for the last decade that's never really been instantiated, which is the notion of a digital Bill of Rights. And we've seen bits and pieces of it. Think about Marco Civil in Brazil, or some of the stuff that's been done in the EU, especially the right to be forgotten. But you know, as we're talking about the kind of you know, the challenges of regulations that address you know, incremental regulations that address an exponentially changing technology landscape, does it make sense to think about statements of general principle phrased in terms of you know, basic consumer or citizens' rights that are a priori and predate technological innovation to act as kind of stopgap measures on the excesses of commercial or technological overreach? Is that a middle path that would be amenable to both of you?
That's the GDPR. I mean, that's Europe. You know, that's the Data Protection Directive from 1995, which itself, I mean, there's this wonderful history that forks where, so the first data protection law in the world is in Germany in 1970, but at the same time, FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, comes out in 1970 as well, which is essentially a use regulations law, a whitelisting law. And then in 1973, you have the Hugh Report, which articulate the fair information principles. And then you get to 1980, and then you have the Privacy Act of 1974, which implements it, that the industry managed to get itself out of. And in 1980, you have the OECD principles, which form essentially the Data Protection Directive of 1995. Also form the Fair Information Practice principles that are operative in the United States, but they are soft law, they are aspirational, they are norm-oriented, they don't have the force of law. But Europe went ahead with the idea that these rights should be embedded. And so Europe is very focused on the concept of fundamental rights, and the GDPR doubles down on that idea. And essentially, the idea is that rights are flexible long-term instruments that are subject to continual reinterpretation based on the conditions of the day. We do that with civil rights, right? It took a while for America to get something resembling a body of civil rights going, and we did. And now they're applied in a variety of new cases. So, you know, when we had redlining, which said that discrimination was odious in having people in situations where you want to rent or give mortgages and loans to people. And so what is the modern equivalent of redlining, and how do we detect it? This is one of the really hard problems today, is the detection of discriminatory practices in an algorithmically driven world. But the principle that's animating that is civil rights. And so we can see there the very great necessity for that kind of flexible spine to the approach of these new types of problems.
Adam, I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So when we think about things like the digital Bill of Rights, especially when it's in the form of affirmative regulatory obligations, we have to think about how that might mesh with or conflict with the pre-existing Bill of Rights in the United States, and namely with the First Amendment, which is going to create a serious tension if the Digital Bill of Rights is a bill of restrictions on data collection or observation, because to the extent America has an overarching fair information practice, it is the First Amendment and a freedom to observe and collect information and repeat information. Now, not everyone agrees with the primacy of the First Amendment as the ultimate informational trump. Clearly, this is not something shared by our friends in Europe, who have a very different vision for balancing these rights out and treating privacy as a trump over freedom of speech in many cases. But that tension is undeniable, and it's not going away. And when most of my work is focused not on the high-level abstract stuff that we've been talking here today, but really more about how we operationalize these things. What would it mean to actually implement a digital privacy Bill of Rights, and could it withstand constitutional scrutiny? I have a very, very hard time believing it would, because, like it or not, the First Amendment is a sort of a deregulatory sledgehammer in the United States. Whatever it touches goes away. And I would think that would include something like this idea.
If I may, I just want to say, the First Amendment is for humans. It's not for corporations.
But that's not, that doesn't solve your problem.
It does in part, in the sense that preventing types of collection and use doesn't step on the First Amendment rights of other humans. Steps on the ostensible rights of companies that have rights of personhood that have been developed over the course of 120 years.
We could argue about philosophical priors about rights of people versus corporations. As a matter of law in the United States, you're wrong. Corporations do end up having these rights.
No, you're right.
Right.
You're right. I am
So,
taking a philosophical position. It's absolutely right.
And it's fine to articulate that, but practically speaking, there's a lot of wishful thinking tied up in what you're proposing, I think, or what we think.
I
Took a while
would
to get
literally
here.
love to
It could take a
have
while to get somewhere else.
a 3-hour audio clip of you guys debating this all the way down the rabbit hole, but I do want to make room for one more question before we have to split. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, the two of you, for your presentations. I think it's a question for any of you, but more for Dr. Gilad. You mentioned the precautionary principle. As I understood you, you always have to answer the question whether do you see a problem, right? Part of the answer to the question is that there is always something to protect, right? Whether it is if the internet users' rights, and if that's not enough, there is always the national interest, which is a tricky concept that changes all over the time. Those are the basis for these blitzkrieg laws over the internet infrastructure in Russia and in China. Like, if that is not enough, the GDPR comes with the adequacy principle, which basically implies the negotiation one-on-one between the European Union and in each country of the world, and maybe some amendments in the legislation of each country of the world. So this is going to have a huge impact in the innovation. It's going to delay it.
Great.
So at what extent, and this is my question, if, as you say, regulation is necessary, and we do not have any assessment yet, and we don't know how long just for citing the GDPR is going to take, when regulation has to stop, or when should be stopped?
I mean, firstly, let me just clarify and say that I'm championing attendance to the precautionary principle. I'm not championing regulation at all costs. That doesn't make sense to me. These are regulations applied in different systems. But it also is true that you live in a completely regulated environment. Regulation doesn't stop. The reason the ceiling doesn't fall and that we're not electrocuted when we plug our computers in, and that the air has only X amount of parts per million of pollutants, and that you drive on the right side of the road, and you live in a relentlessly regulated, governed environment. Civility and civilization means to be governed. You are governed. We are all governed. We will be governed forever, long past our deaths. And the question is, who's governing us? And one of the places that Adam and I are singing the same tune is about norms and the value of norms and the utility of norms. They're incredibly powerful. When you walk by an apple cart, what prevents you from not stealing the apple is not a gate, it's a norm. And this is pervasive throughout society. And so governance is this incredibly broad idea, of which regulation, in the sense of action that comes from a body that has power, has no boundaries, has no edges. The question is, who's governing you? Are you self-governing? Are you being governed by the market? Are you being governed by norms? Regulation is, behavior shaping. And essentially, I think it's probably best to just conceive of regulation and governance in that very broad fashion.
Adam, did you want to have a last word?
Well, we can conceive of regulation as behavior shaping. It doesn't answer the question of what sort of behavior we want to make verboten and to say should not be allowed. The challenge in these debates that will remain is finding some sort of consensus on what type of activities we do have to draw some lines on and to impose a more precautionary cast. But the reality is that, principally speaking, that debate is not as much of an interest to me as you would think, having written a book on permissionless innovation versus the precautionary principle. I'm squarely rooted now in the world of sort of what works practically speaking and how we move forward. The question of how we shape behavior, as Gilad has suggested, could be through norms, it could be through market mechanisms, it could be through formal government regulation. Increasingly, it's a combination of all those things, but in one big messy bucket called soft law. And this sort of form of technological governance for the IoT is already taking shape. I think there's a lot to be said for it, but I think it's obviously going to be extraordinarily uncomfortable and, as I said, messy in how it unfolds. But practically speaking, I don't really think there is another alternative. I think a lot of what Gilad has said in response to me today has been based on, as I will characterize it again, a bit of wishful thinking about the way the world should work for the better, for the public interest, for the public good, for the national good, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, sure, I agree with some of it, maybe not all of it, but the reality is that we're going to have a totally different, sort of more pragmatic approach to a fast-paced, highly evolving kind of set of technologies like the IoT. And I don't think we get there with the kind of vision he suggested.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm even more torn than I was at the outset of this panel, and that's a very good sign that we had some science dropped on us. So I want to have a huge round of applause and gratitude for Adam and for Gilad. And I think we've got lunch coming up. I guess I'll toss things back to Andrew, who's going to fill you in on what comes next. Thank you all for being here.
So,
Thank you for moderating. Appreciate it.
Okay.
My voice didn't give out. So yeah.
lunch is outside. Please help yourselves. You can bring it back in here, or you can